Bienvenidos a esta nueva edición de Trading, Risk and Beyond, donde les traemos lo último y lo mejor de los líderes y protagonistas del sector financiero. Soy Gerardo Herrera, su anfitrión. En esta ocasión el tema que discutiremos es riesgo de crédito, presente y futuro. Como todas las disciplinas de finanzas, el riesgo de crédito ha sido reexaminado, reestudiado y reevaluado después de la crisis de 2008. El día de hoy tenemos con nosotros a una persona que es emblemática de esta disciplina. Algunos lo consideran realmente el padre de la disciplina en tiempos modernos. Edward Altman, de la New York University. Acompáñenos en nuestra plática con él, donde discutiremos temas como cuál es el estado actual del riesgo de crédito, qué es lo que podemos esperar hacia el futuro, qué autores son los más importantes en esta disciplina en estos momentos y sobre todo, cuál es la situación actual de México, Latinoamérica y Estados Unidos y Europa en lo que corresponde a los niveles de endeudamiento y el riesgo de una crisis de impago. Acompáñenme. Mr. Altman, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Same here.
Let's start with a simple question. What have we learned from the last crisis? Did we learn something?
Well, we always learn from history, at least we should. The last crisis had the primary catalyst being the mortgage-backed security crisis in the U.S. But in addition, we should have learned about the bubble that was building before the crisis, not only in mortgage-backed, but also in credit and debt in general. We were building up an enormous amount of debt to grow the economies of the world, and the bubble was building. Hopefully, we can learn from that because, in my opinion, we are again seeing a big buildup in debt, particularly in the industrial or corporate sector. Less so, of course, in the financial sector. And this, I think, is not well understood by the markets because the markets today are very sympathetic, very easy for raising credit at low interest rates, at least in the United States and most countries. This, however, promotes more debt, more leverage, more risk, which could result in another crisis.
Are we facing another irrational exuberance?
I think I don't usually use the word in the debt markets as had been done in equity, but I do believe we are getting a little ahead of ourselves in terms of the amount of risk we can safely manage. And so if that is irrational exuberance, then it's an appropriate term.
Which ones propagate faster? Banking, government, corporations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if it's easy to say which one comes first, but I would think that we have learned from history that the corporate sector tends to grow with debt, and that oftentimes precedes problems in the sovereign or in the markets. Let me give you an example. We have a new model for assessing sovereign risk. And the innovation in our model is that we are looking at the economy from the bottom up rather than the top down. In other words, we are looking at the health of the private sector, both corporates and banks, to help identify sovereign problems before they take place. The traditional analysis, and the one that most governments, most regulatory agencies, and most analysts use, is a top-down approach, looking at general metrics of overall government performance. Debt to GDP, deficits to GDP, growth rates, unemployment. While these are helpful they rarely identify a problem until it's too late. Our technique has been shown to predict sovereigns that get into trouble, particularly in Southeast Asia in 1997-98, and again in Europe in 2009, 2010. And what I'm proposing is central banks, regulators, and indeed markets in general look more carefully at the health of the private sector in a very rigorous way to identify potential crises. And I'm particularly concerned today with the fact that some of the European countries have not really solved their fundamental problems, even though the markets have calmed down. And even a few Latin American economies are showing some signs of distress. Now, I'm not talking about Mexico in this case, and I know most of your audience are in Mexico, but I would be concerned with what is happening in countries like Brazil and Argentina. Both of them are showing strong signals of financial distress at the current time.
Okay. Now that we're talking about the region, and I'll go back to Latin America as a region, specifically for Mexico, we have had in recent years, 2 years ago, we had a scandal, HSBC related, that exploded in the US. It created a big concern in the US about money laundering, etc. The Senate called HSBC to hearings, etc. And in the last few months, the Mexican subsidiary of Citibank, Banamex, has run into trouble. These are not financial ratios related crises. These are executive crises, performance, ethics.
Yeah.
But what does that say about our banking system from your viewpoint from abroad?
Well, I think you don't have to take credit for being unethical in banking. It is pervasive in the world. It's not a Mexican problem only.
Okay.
We've had our own problems in the US. Of course, we had the London whale problem for JP Morgan Chase. More recently, we've had the LIBOR problem starting in the UK. So ethical problems or scandals sometimes are a catalyst to more fundamental problems. I'm not concerned with scandals. I'm more concerned with fundamentals. If, however, you discover fundamental issues because of a scandal, then maybe the scandal has some benefit. But the scandal can put certain institutions into jeopardy, and if they are systemic institutions, meaning they have relevance for the entire economy or the global economy, then a scandal can become very important.
Let's talk about the private sector in Latin America based on your studies. How do you evaluate them? What is your assessment of the private sector in Mexico compared to the private sector in the US?
Well, the way we look at it is we assess the health of all the companies we can get data on, usually listed companies on the stock exchange. But if I was working with the Central Bank of Mexico, and I have done some work also with the Mexican Treasury Group, the idea was to kind of look at the probability of default and how that's changing over time of a number of companies, aggregating that to the sovereign level, and then compare that across countries and over time. So you ask about Mexico compared to the United States, but I think you also should compare Mexico to other Latin American countries. Mm-hmm. Compared to the United States, Mexico is more risky. That's no secret. We are one of the most credit-worthy countries with respect to companies. Brazil has one of the highest probability of defaults. And so I'm concerned with Brazil, and I'm also concerned with Argentina. Compared to Mexico, I think is looking fairly healthy from a bottom-up approach. I would say it's on par with a number of other very good countries of the world, and I don't see any systemic problem in Mexico at the moment. But I would be very careful to make sure that this continues. And the way to do it is to unemotionally, objectively measure this situation. And so I would expect that Mexico is in pretty decent shape and deserves the investment grade rating that it now has.
Okay, funny that you mentioned this because everybody knows that worldwide, outside Latin America especially, the deer of Latin America is Brazil. Is the country that everybody celebrates about, the Brazilian miracle, etc. Exactly. And Mexico has fallen kind of into the shadows, into the shadow of Brazil. Do you think this assessment is fair?
Well, certainly Brazil deserves a lot of attention because of its size and because it is, for better or for worse, considered one of the BRIC countries, which of course are the most important emerging market countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And so it has been promoted in that respect. I think Mexico is quite important also. I think probably the second most important country in Latin America in terms of size and impact on the global economy. The problem with Brazil is the fact that it has grown with using too much debt and not translating the money that has flowed into it to fundamental improvements. And I'm talking about the oil industry, I'm talking about the infrastructure in the country, and I'm talking about the political will to make difficult decisions. And to be fair to the Brazilian government, they have sacrificed, I think, corporate health for social improvements. Now, you have to understand that this can come at great cost. And this other thing is what's happening today. Mexico, I think, deserves to be quite prominent, not just because I'm here in Mexico. I think it's unquestionably the second most important country in Latin America. And if you had 3 times as many people as you now have, you would be probably number 1. I think it's a function of that. It's the same thing in Europe or Russia or the United States or China or India. A lot has to do with population size and its potential impact on the rest of the world, commodity-wise as well as financial system. So I think Brazil deserves to be in everybody's radar screen. As a result, let's be fair and look at it rationally. And Brazil has big problems. And we should recognize that, and so should their government.
You are considered one of the fathers of credit risk analysis. Your C-score model is one that many of us have studied, have been taught about, going beyond the simple fundamental ratios. How has the model evolved in the last few years? A very brief assessment of how it has grown.
Well, thank you for your comment, and I'm as surprised as anyone that after almost 50 years, the model is still robust, being used, and still quite accurate. One of its attributes that makes it quite popular is it's free. Anybody can try it. And if they don't like it, they can reject it. And if they like it, they can use it. How it has evolved is very interesting. Is that the old model, the one that was built almost 50 years ago, was based on data of companies from that period. And therefore is probably out of date today in one sense. And that is, at least in the United States, I'm convinced, and I'm not sure about Mexico. Maybe the Mexican experts can answer the question. But in the United States, we clearly see that the average company is far more risky today than it was 50 years ago, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. And that's because of the extensive use of leverage, and particularly what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years with the cost of credit being so low. Mexico probably is quite similar in the fact that the average Mexican company is more risky, even though it's probably more profitable than it was 10 years ago. So how has it evolved? The one thing that has evolved is I've built models, which are now quite well known, for emerging markets. So I would say it's better to use an emerging market model than a US model to evaluate Mexican, Brazilian, Argentinian companies. Second, if you use the original Z, which is easily available in from many sources, then you should not use the scores that used to be considered as cutoff for distress. You should be using what I call bond rating equivalent score, which has changed over time. So the average B-rated company has a certain score today that is quite different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago, AAA and so on. One other comment that I'd like to make, and I know this may not be popular with some of the government officials who are regulators. What I learned today in the seminar that we gave for RiskMathics, and we had some representatives from the pension industry, from banks, etc., in the audience, is the fact that for pension fund investments in Mexico, you must be a company to invest in for the government to invest in a corporate bond, you must be at least A-rated from the rating agencies, A, AA, AAA, which means that a whole segment of the population of corporates are eliminated from consideration. And I'm talking about triple B, double B, and so on. And I think this is limiting the potential returns to the pension fund and therefore to the government workers in this case, and maybe even in the private sector. Especially since you are conservative anyway by limiting the amount of corporate bonds in a portfolio of pension fund assets to a maximum of 20%, which is, I think, the government's ratio. So why not take more risk of that 20% basket to enhance the return, because the history of bond market performance shows that the risk-return trade-off is very favorable as you go down the credit scale, as long as you have a diversified portfolio and as long as you understand credit risk management, which I hope that models like my own have contributed to this knowledge over time. So my recommendation to Mexico and to other countries that are quite conservative with their pension fund investments is loosen up. Take a little bit more risk as long as it's prudent and as long as you have a limit as to how much can be invested in what we call alternative investments.
Sin lugar a duda, el riesgo de crédito sigue siendo un tema de actualidad y relevancia y que nos proporciona mecanismos y parámetros que nos permiten adelantarnos o prever la posibilidad de crisis futuras. Soy Gerardo Herrera, les agradezco que nos haya acompañado y les invitamos a los siguientes programas de Trading, Risk and Beyond.